Sorry, I'm late. We're late. We're here now. So, good evening. I'm Stephen Yenser. I'm still kind of in the English department. No, I'm not. I'm in on the fringes of the English department at UCLA. The department has sponsored these readings for over 50 years. And for most of those years, the Hammer has been its venue, although we began up at the Sunset Canyon Recreation Center many years ago. But the Hammer has been the venue, and it's a great place to have a reading or to do anything, really. And it's been the primary benefactor of the readings. And for most of those years, its polymathic impresario has been the auspiciously named Claudia Bestor. Names. I see some familiar faces. That's nice, given all the distractions there are these days. And I think I now have a name for at least some of those faces. I came across a periodical article, not just recently, about an enthusiastic ecologist who works in the Cayman Islands and who was quoted above the story as follows. "It was just so wonderful to see, I couldn't believe it," she said. And so I got into the story, and she was talking about a school of an essential but endangered species of shark. You know what they're called? They're called hammerheads. So I figure some of you guys here are hammerheads. I'm being frivolous. I mean, we aren't endangered, right? We're not an endangered species, no. But there is a connection here to tonight's reading. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Are you hearing me all right? Thank you. There is a connection. In fact, the mainspring of Penelope Pelizzon's masterful new volume, A Gaze Hound That Hunteth by the Eye, is the conviction, according to me, that connections themselves are ineluctable and profound. They are implicit throughout Penelope's formal infrastructures, the carefully carved, mostly syllabic prosody, and the deftly, often lightly rhymed lines. As a subject, connections are hardly unusual today in the advent of the World Wide Web and the discovery of the seemingly infinite networks in nature, whether we're looking at trees, plants, fungi in the forest, or systems of communication in and among living bodies. But abstract recognition of this very useful concept of the network doesn't entail important, let alone concrete and startling, vivid expression, especially in miniature, in intricately crafted details like those in Penelope's poems. It's a very big book. It doesn't have that many pages. It's about average, I guess, for a book of poems. But it covers so much ground, and it is so densely written, so tightly written, so thoughtfully written that it's big. Here's an example of the kind of detail that you're likely to get. And this involves a neighbor of the hammerhead. In the lyric entitled Ill-Starred, the focal point as night falls is a starfish. And magically, the stars are coming out above. They're kind of like exemplary students. They're magically, as the poem says, they magically lean closer, squinting to see you, see thing, chill echinoderm. After a moment, we realize, we understand that the sea thing being addressed is at once a resident of the sea, the starfish, and a celestial body that's looking down on it because it's a sea thing. But the body, of course, is seeing it very carefully. So it's a sea thing, too, this otherworldly body. And, of course, the poet, whose ancestors came from the sea and who can see and hear the dense pun that epitomizes, I think, the principle of intimate connections that here and there the poems explore. Another poem concludes with the intuition that the stars have never lost entirely their literal effect on us, and that some nights, and I'm quoting now, some nights we feel their anxious pull deep inside the animal, asleep inside the animal. And nice pair of lines, initial rhyme, deep, asleep. The animal inside the animal. And of course, this is a case where the relationship is that between spirit and body, with etymology serving as a kind of metaphor. The anima in animal, of course. Relationship that the poem wants to be in part about. One touching motif through the book involves the poet and her dog, although it might be several dogs. The dog appears so often. I tend to think of it as the same dog, but I don't see quite how that can be. So that's beside the point. The poet and her dog are devoted to each other, and they share certain proclivities. Penelope, the speaker, once realizes with a start that given her extraordinary sense of smell, she thinks, I'm a dog. Dogs' feelings aren't complex, you say, begins another poem. They lack our nuances of mood. That's how she opens one poem. But she muses on her companion's chomping on a toy chicken, plastic chicken, and the latter keeps squeaking plaintively. And at the poem's end, Penelope offers that while the dog's expressiveness wants words, still the dog's expressiveness wants words, but still that strain descends into the human soul and sounds depths only the inarticulate can feel. Characteristically, she breaks very cleverly on that word sounds. She goes two ways over the line break. For those of you familiar with the Aeneid, those lines strike me as having to be a version of Virgil's lines on Lacrimae Rerum, which there's famous lines that Seamus Heaney has a good translation of. He says, instead of those lines, there are tears at the heart of things. And that passage seems to me a wonderful kind of elaboration on the tears that are at the heart of things. She calls her own hound, or at least one of them, Chomsky. That's Chomsky with a P. So that we can hear the doggish activity at the same time that we hear the distinguished linguist's name. Language is, again here, the prime means and a kind of prototypical subject, I think, of the poet's networks, which are genealogical, elsewhere in the book, and geographical, cultural, and horticultural. And so vivid and rampant that I could only allude to them here, along with the entire piano that her mother once buried next to her garden. I think the piano was fruitful. This book is full of music, and it has a lot more to say about musical lineage, too, that I'm going to tell you. This is the last poetry reading of the year. And I couldn't be happier that we end with a volume as strong and fine-spun, as earthy and exquisite both, as Penelope's. It reminds me at every turn of what the poet Stanley Kunitz wrote 40 years ago. The supreme awareness we can have is that all existence is a continuous tissue, a gigantic web of interconnected filaments, so delicately woven that if it touched at any point, the whole web trembles. Penelope Pelizzon.
Thank you, Stephen. That was amazing. I learned things from that introduction that I didn't know, so that's the best kind of introduction. I had the chance to read at the Hammer Museum 9 years ago, and the one difference is that last time I was here, I didn't have to put on special glasses to read, but now I do. So that is a sign that something is happening. Time is moving on. I want to thank the amazing staff that has helped to create this event tonight. I wanted to thank Claudia Bestor for her work, and also Shannon Sanova, who was so helpful with getting me here, and I really, really appreciate that. I know how much labor goes into just putting all the pieces together to make an event happen. And also, of course, Stephen, I want to thank you for curating this series. One of the things, it's easy to forget, I think, if you have a series that brings authors in from out of town and from across country, it's easy to forget sometimes when you have an amazing poet in your midst, and that is Stephen Yenser, whose work is astonishing. And if you know Stephen primarily as a curator or an organizer of this event, and you don't know his poems, you should stop everything after this and please go read his work, because it will really change you and change your life and bring richness to it. So I want to, excuse me, I want to actually open here by just telling you a little bit about an epigraph that begins this book, which I think makes sense with some of the poems I'll read and links them together. So this is a photograph of a Post-it note that has been sitting over my desk for years. It moves with me when I move. I shift it to different locations, but it's been there for about 10 years. It's a quote by Edmund Jabez. The foreigner allows you to be yourself by making a foreigner of you, which I really think is a wonderful quote for a number of reasons. One of the things that it reminds me of, I have a life in which I've been fortunate enough to be able to travel quite a bit. I'm married to a diplomat, so my work it often travels with me to different parts of the world. But one of the things that is wonderful about this is, so I'm often the foreigner in other situations, and it reminds me to try to continue to be a foreigner, to be, in other words, maybe the opposite of somebody who is a colonist, right? A colonist in the most basic sense is somebody who goes to other people's houses and makes them their own. There's something wonderful about the idea of remaining foreign and allowing yourself to experience that foreignness and also to cherish that foreignness, even when you come back to the place that you come from, right? And I think that there's something about that ability to allow foreignness to coexist in you and in other people that speaks to what's at the heart of poetry for me, which would be this ability to both see the familiar and the strange and the familiar. And I think that that's something that for me is, that's a kind of motif that inspires a lot of my work. So hopefully that will make sense here. And you're not obliged to read the visuals. I put the poems onto slides because I know that sometimes for some people it can make a reading a little bit more accessible if they have visual aids. So I'm going to read as clearly as possible and hope that you will have a wonderful auditory experience. So please don't feel obliged to follow along in the text, but if you're someone who finds it a little bit easier to have a visual aid, you'll have those there for yourself. So I'm going to open with a poem called Orts and Slarts. Orts and slarts. Orts and slarts, it's a great old-fashioned words for like organic bits or like scraps left over. And the speaker in this poem is dealing, with the situation of having a little bit of indigestion. She's eaten something a little bit funny, and that comes across in the poem. One of the things that I really wanted to do in this poem is capture something that I feel like is not present enough in contemporary American poetry, which is the energy of boys aged about 7 to 11 years old. Does anyone have a 7 to 11-year-old boy? Okay, see a few hands. Or you have had at some point a 7-year-old boy? Okay, good. Excuse me. So you have to picture that 7 to 11-year-old boy energy is kind of informing us here. Orts and slarts. Nothing's less romantic than a dish of lentils amped up with ramps and garlic, turning you into a wind instrument sprawled across the couch in torment. Nothing's more humorous than an aunt embarrassed, her innards muttering crass blasphemies in some guttural Proto-Nordic dialect. Well, gassy lassie, none will celebrate your dignity's lapse happily as this trio of nephews, avid hagiographers who praise the body's stinks and stews, its anarchy deflating false modesty. They mythologize their seismic erectations and erections, regale you with sagas of J's pus blister and how D's whacked head bled, and when W yacked asparagus in the tub. It's sublime, really, what fumes to the surface when expert fartisans descend to hilarity. You'd have an awkward time with politer friends who lacked these children's intimacy with the rebellious corpus, unable much of the fall to hug their father, whose kisses the chemo made radioactive. Their hero is not a brute Hercules dragging his pelt, but the gaunt man whose eyebrows have just begun caterpillaring back, who spoons pancake batter onto the griddle to birth their favorite animals. Eggless batter, since their systems aggressively reject allergens. What poison came home in sippy cup lids or pacifiers, with milk in plastic cartons? Toxins tasteless in the butter-sweet colostrum, warm from the nipple of a mama bear who's breathed what breezes off the golf course, airport, highway, slaughterhouse, mephitic sugar refining plant. An egg mishap, unlike a fuck-up with nuts, might not kill anyone, but surely would induce great bouts of yakking in the tub and flatulence, a word they can't stop wafting in laughter as mom rebukes yet again, yanking the pouch from a hand old enough to know better. No cursing, please. These aren't toys. Your EpiPen is not a gun. Okay, shifting gears a little bit here. So we are near the Pacific Ocean. The beautiful ocean is right nearby. How many people like to walk on the ocean? Okay. All right, so this poem is for you then. The speaker in this poem is someone who is feeling a little bit depressed and goes to take a walk on the beach to change their mood, her mood. So you will perhaps appreciate this if you've ever done that yourself. Cliché. Its back and forth ad nauseum ought to make the sea a bore, but walks along the shore cure me. Salt wind's the best solution for dissolving my ennui in, along with these protean sadnesses that sometimes swim invisibly as comb jelly, a glass or two of wine below my surface. Some regrets won't untangle. Others loosen as I watch the waves spreading their torn nets of foam along the sand to dry. I walk and walk and walk and walk, letting their haul absorb me. One seal's hull, scuttled to bone staves, gulls scream, wheeling above. And here, small, diabolical, a skate's egg case, its horned purse nested on pods of bladderwort that still squirt brine by the eyeful. Some oily slabs of whale skin, or no, just an edge of tire, flensed from a commoner leviathan. Everywhere, plastic nurdles gleam like pearls or caviar for the avian gourmand, and bits of sponge dab the wounded rack line, dried to froths of air smelling of iodine. Hours blow off down the beach like spindrift, leaving me with an immense, less solipsistic sense of ruin, and, as if it's a gift, assurance of ruin's recurrence. All right, it's time for a little love poem. We were talking about love poems in the green room earlier. So I want to share one with you. So this is a poem called Some Say. And there's a little bit of information that will be useful with this one. So a lot of the poems in this book speak back to older poems or older poets. So there's a lot of dialogue sort of across time and through time with writers who have been important to me. And this is in response to a Sappho fragment, one of the very famous Sappho fragments, fragment number 16, which, if translated, roughly would go something like this. Some say it's a force of cavalry, others of foot soldiers, others of ships, but I say that the most beautiful thing on the black earth is whatever it is you desire. So that's the Sappho fragment. And I have loved this poem for a long time, but it always struck me as odd, right? Like, this is a love poem, and yet it has all this military language in it, this military metaphors. Why in a love poem have military metaphors? How odd is that, right? But that was when I was much younger, and then I got married, and I've been married for 25 years, but my husband would say the same thing. Now I totally understand the military metaphors, right? 25 years of marriage, and you get it. So it strikes me that that this is actually this is an intensely lovely thing, right? To think that there's somebody who could inspire rage and anger and a desire for a sort of warfare in you, but that you would still love them, or perhaps even love them more profoundly because they bring that out in you and you experience that so deeply. So it felt to me like that was something very crucial in the poem. But I also wanted to bring it into the present. So there are some mentions of things in the poem that might be useful to know. There's a mention of a Sukhoi T-50. A Sukhoi T-50 is a Russian military jet, and it's able to do this amazing maneuver called a Pugachev's Cobra, in which, if it is being pursued, the Sukhoi T-50 can do an evasive maneuver where if it's flying, it can essentially stop in the air and pull up on its tail like this, which then allows the plane that is pursuing it to bypass it, so the Sukhoi T-50 can drop down and become the pursuing plane. So it's this kind of astonishing military maneuver, which I learned about and was just so taken with it visually that it stayed with me, and then it found its way into this poem. So that's all you need to know. Some say, after Sappho, fragment 16. When I look at him and feel under my ribs a Sukhoi T-50 performing a Pugachev's Cobra, no longer as an evasive maneuver, but for the thrilling thrust vector stomach plunge, and my limbic system's an alembic, distilling chilled champagne from rocket fuel, and my gray hairs are the smoke off ships whose burning all night bloodied the eastern sky before dawn doused their charcoal spars in cold light, whitening his beard with ash. And in the flotsam washed to the beach, we find a ring, a feather, a key, a watch. Then 20 years collapse like a star. We're children, giggling again at the altar. The night I knew, that one. Hackles up, I snapped at his throat, hot bark I could not swallow, unkennelled self gone feral, my words all canine and carnassial. And him, raising against me finally, one eyebrow, turning away on his pillow, leaving me licking my salt and singular fury. Cheek pressed to drain below the pissing shower, for hours I lay gutted by the cool blade of his refusal even to enter the fray. That one. All night, an army of ships, of horses, an army of men on foot marched through me, and him, unarmed, unharmed, on the black earth, sleeping. How are you doing? Okay, good. Okay, you're okay, good. It's the end of the semester, it's Tuesday, you've come a long way. I know I appreciate your being here. I know how tiring it can get to be at the end of the semester. Okay, the next poem is called Sentimental Education. And this is an old poem. This is actually the oldest poem in this collection. It's a poem that I wrote many years ago, published in a magazine, and then it didn't go into my last book because it wasn't really thematically appropriate. And it kind of sat around unhoused for a while. And then when I was putting this collection together, it seemed like, oh, this actually has a lot of resonance with some of the other issues here. This poem is well, it's a complex poem in the sense that this is a poem that started simply as a personal experience poem. It was as a lyric talking about a person having what was a private experience, but then because history happened and some legislation happened, this became a political poem. So the speaker in this poem is set in Texas. It's set in the city of Houston, which if you happen to know Houston, you'll recognize it. The speaker is waiting to have an abortion, something that in Houston now would not be possible in the way that it was a long time ago. Sentimental education. The new hormones built me a sense of smell, 3D, architectural. I could measure rooms' volumes by the density of perfumes curdling in the air. From down the hall behind 3 doors, tight shut, whiffs of my lover's shampoo queezed back to the bedroom, florid pink jellies slicking down to sugar the biscuit of his nape. Cheese scraps pared and scraped into the sink baited complex traps of stink set to spring in the apartment's heat. Strange metamorphic creature, half mutt nose, half mouse terror, at whom the least reek bared its teeth. A lick of margarine barked and bit, metallic. Even bread wasn't innocent. Its yeasts were simply waiting till I started sniffing to ferment. I'm a dog, I thought. But some part of me couldn't stop tugging as far as my senses' leash would allow, and it was almost worth the nauseous swallow to leave my body there below the sheet and follow a draft out through the screen, past the porch, the yard, the rot-spiced knot pine fence hunched over its hibiscus crutch, past the live oak's mushroom-musky nets of moss, beyond the on-ramp to the overpass, the freeway's scorched oils and vinyls, chlorides and smokes, and the airport's kerosene, out further than the shrimp boats rocking toy-like on the swells, to where the salt skirts of a rainstorm, just beginning to gather in loose bellying folds above the Gulf, dragged their hem in the sea and grew damp with a clean ozone ruffle. I asked to stay awake through the procedure. And for a week or so after, as the hormones faded, was visited by ghostly odors, water drying, the iron in stones. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit again and read a poem called Elegy for Blank. The blank, so the poem's a little bit of a riddle. You get to guess what the blank is. I think you will be able to do that. A lot of the poems in this book deal with environmental concerns, not surprisingly, because like things are on fire. Perhaps you've noticed that out here, right? Like things are not good. In the part of the country that I am often in, we're not having fires, but we're having a lot of things like devastating insect infestations that are killing whole swaths of forests and things like that. So it's pretty hard to ignore all that. And if you're a poet, that comes out in the work. So this is a poem that Claudia's from New England, so this you will recognize what this poem is about, because this is a thing that we used to have a lot of in New England. It used to be one of the things that typified our part of the country, there hasn't been so much of it anymore. So I'll let you figure out what it is. And again, the thing is not mentioned in the poem because it's not there. And an elegy is a poem of mourning, so it's mourning for that thing. One other thing, the poem is in two voices, so I think it's pretty clear when I read it what those are, but just in case that's maybe not obvious, it's going back and forth between a questioner and questions. Elegy for, there's no, what was it? Cold sparks from the moon, cold flecks of spit dashed from the wolves' teeth as they surged down from the north, ice alight in their fur. I caught it on my tongue, calling its falling like petals, pollen, pale feathers, swarms of silver bees, like a jillion glassy minnows aswim in the jar of light below the street lamp. An old book compared it to grain hoarded in heaven's storehouse, till its master saith, "Be thou on the earth." And sometimes it fell slowly, careful as the snippets dropped by a child's scissors cutting out its image from a sheet of paper folded into pleats. Drifts, we named its gatherings, and we piled it up in poems on breasts white as, hands white as, cheeks pale as, building effigies of women for centuries, freezing and thawing, thawing and freezing. But I don't blame it for all the mouths it melted in. So did you ever see it? I saw it many times. You saw it many times? Many. Or once, and once, and once, and once, each flake unique, as we liked saying. But what did we mean? Was each more singular than any beetle wing, water drop, dust grain magnified, more singular than the merged, scintillant irises of anyone I ever swam into while kissing? A loveliness that more and more, or less and less, each winter stung me. Those specks landing for an instant on a coat sleeve, naked branch, horse's whiskers, the gray wrinkles of the river, swallowing them, fleeting as if they'd never been. Could you guess what it was? Do you want to whisper it in my ear? It's about snow. I'm going to read another snow poem. This is one of the poems that Stephen alluded to. Their dog is a composite. There are a lot of dogs in this poem. Actually, a friend joked with me that I needed to put a disclaimer on here to let people know that the title, A Gaze Hound That Hunteth by the Eye, that this is not a book about how to train seeing eye dogs. So it would not be, it's not a manual for that. But there are a lot of dogs. Here's one of them, Call and Response. This is a poem speaking back in some ways to Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, because you cannot be a poet from New England and not have a poem responding to Robert Frost. Does anyone remember how Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening goes? Yes, yes. Yeah, bring it on. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So Frost is using a type of stanza there called a rubaiyat stanza that has these three rhymes. The third line in each stanza tumbles down to rhyme with the next. It's a sort of tumbling rhyme. This uses that form very, very, very lightly. And Frost's poem is only 4 stanzas long. Mine took 5 stanzas to get not really where he goes. So it's only an homage in some very loose ways, but it is an homage. Call and Response. A nervous dog will snap at wind that snarls outdoors as snows descend, till only walking pacifies the wolf awoken in the hound. We trudge the path we've memorized, our coats first nipped, then gnashed at by fangs within the sharpened cold, grown sharper as the daylight dies. Ice rusts the hinges of the oaks. Like owls, they screech at us below, and we, forgetting what we are, flinch beneath that killing blow. But soon we're swallowed in the roar, streams of rush hour traffic pour. Pink neon from the Eastbrook Mall, our northern lights, erases stars we know still seethe, invisible. These nights we feel their anxious pull deep inside the animal, asleep inside each animal. And the next poem that I'll read is continuing this theme of environmental distress and mourning. So the poem is called Gypsy Moths, and I don't know if people out here are familiar with gypsy moths. Are these something that you all have? You don't have. You have something. I'm sure you have some version of your own invasive insect. So gypsy moths are these. They're a caterpillar that. Their favorite food is oak leaves, but they are not discriminate. They will eat anything, basically down to the nubbin. So if the gypsy moth, if there's an infestation, which happens fairly frequently because there used to be their hatching used to occur at a point when there was a fungus that the rainy season would bring on, so that the fungus would actually keep the population of the gypsy moths down. So they were not as dramatic a problem as they've become in the last few years when rain patterns have changed. So another thing that's interesting about the gypsy moths is they were an intentional import. They were brought to New England in the 1880s as a substitute for silk moths, because of course New England textiles, there was a small but burgeoning interest in trying to make silk in the area. And there's sort of cottage industries of silkworms. We have a lot of mulberry trees planted around for that purpose. But the thing that you might know about silkworms, of course, is that mulberry are the only thing that they will eat, right? That they're very finicky. So in New England, you can't grow enough mulberry trees to feed all the silkworms. It's complicated. So an intrepid speculator had the idea to import another type of caterpillar, the gypsy moths. And he thought, wouldn't it be great if we had a caterpillar that wouldn't eat just mulberry leaves, but would eat all kinds of leaves? We could feed it anything. And that was fine for a bit. And then the way that I've heard this narrative is that sometime around 1880 in Medford, Massachusetts, where he was farming these creatures, a window got broken and some of these creatures got outside. And this speculator informed the local authorities, who at the time, it seemed like thought, a few caterpillars got out. What's the big deal? And so here we are now having this devastation. So that's your little lecture on the caterpillar. There's a reference to bombyx in here. The bombyx is the silk moth. So gypsy moths. A silk mistake imported for your thread's potential, the shantung shining in the speculator's eyes, since you, unlike your cousin bombyx, graze unfinicky on leaves of every species. Now you nibble forests to lace. A silicotic lung sickens one morning in my oak tree's vast estate. Its speckles hatch, and soon, by inches, devastate, chewing till I walk among slicks of frass to mourn the branches' skeletons. The woods around me rustle with the patter of countless soft digestive tubes raining fecal matter as you profit from distemper in the seasons. One fungus, finding you delicious, spun through you every spring and snipped your threads within. But that was back before the weeks of wet its spores required to sprout began delaying arrival while your eggs had not. You curse the deer, the nesting birds, the squirrel, all who forage acorns or shelter in the foliage. You curse the person who can hear a tree falling before it falls, who loved its leaves on days when the weather was changeable as a mind, susurrating in wind and silvering their silky, freshly woven sleeves. Okay, I'm going to read you the title poem. Can you handle a slightly longer poem? Are you okay? All right. Okay, so this poem is called A Gaze Hound That Hunteth by the Eye. This is a poem that is talking back to a gentleman named William Harrison, who was the vicar of Wimbish. He's a 16th century gentleman, and he is famous because he's an author who wrote one of the sections, or some of the sections, of Holinshead Chronicles, which is famously the volume of chronicles from which Shakespeare got many of his histories, many of the stories that he then adapted into his plays. So we know a lot of these stories, but they originally come from Holinshead Chronicles. William Harrison wrote a number of sections of these chronicles that cataloged things that were part of the British Empire at the time. And he has a section of these chronicles called Of Our English Dogs and Their Qualities. And he catalogs a bunch of different types of dogs. And he also has some things to say about middle-aged ladies and their pets. And he is very disparaging of women of a certain age who spend too much time tending to their dogs. So I thought that William Harrison, vicar of Wimbish, needed to be talked back to a little bit. So I'm sort of in conversation with him in this poem. The poem is set during the pandemic. I think that's obvious from some details if you're reading it, but if you're just hearing it aloud, maybe it's easy to miss that. So the speaker is alone with her dog in the poem, and a lot of it. And the poem moves back and forth through time, but I think that's pretty clear. There are some observations in the poem about wretched leadership. And the poem, there's a moment in here where the speaker is reading Shakespeare's Richard II. And one of the problems of Richard II is that he was not a good leader. So there are some meditations on wretched leadership in the pandemic. So maybe there's some allusions to larger situations outside, but I will let you figure that out if there's anything going on there. A gaze hound that hunteth by the eye. responding to William Harrison's Of Our English Dogs and Their Qualities, Hollinshead's Chronicles, 1587. It's not criminal. It isn't sodomy or taking horses to Scotland or poaching the king's deer, though it seems like witchcraft, this entranced spasm of pleasure my presence triggers in my wriggling pup. Now lap ensconced, she gobbles a fancy kiln-dried carp skin, snowing its small, smelly flakes on the carpet. Her squid tentacle tongue slaps my chin. Joy. But this cuddling repels Mr. Harrison, Vicar of Wimbish. He's gathered descriptions of English dogs, furniture, fashions, fairs, sundry corporal punishments, and ships flying Her Majesty's flag, as for chronicles Shakespeare will pinch from to flesh out his kings. If I didn't know by now how much I know sieves down to me from men who winced at dames, soothing their hot spells or chilly wombs with love, minced into morsels and hand-fed to pets, my face would sting afresh below the vicar's volley of slaps. How he despises us, irksome older women, trifling away all treasure of time with our perverse cossetings. Some feeble-palsied ladies even tuck a little peak or pug inside their shawls for warmth. Poor man, he's better off dead. Not here, forced to catalog how today I climbed off my broomstick and smooched my leashed familiar shamelessly on her damp nose, taking her along to weed my pandemic victory garden. Of course, true victory gardens grow human food. My perennials will feed mainly bees. Call it my foresight garden, all charms still speculative. Last week, I lost hours online looking for blue false indigo, native but hard to find this season of quarantined green thumbs with their itchy digger fingers lusting to plug a few dead-seeming sticks in dirt. My vaccine against panics fussing about how I'm going to set this smatter of pale blue hearts aflutter over new beds of hyssop. Soiled and toil-sore from planting, last night I bedded King Richard II, book on my belly in air finally warm enough to lie naked atop the sheets in, windows flung open to the spring peeper's rainy bells. In Shakespeare's Uterus of a Mind, the chronicle seeded this fruit. It offered me toothsome distractions from the news. Richard's a wretched leader, but he's not a human trash fire like some. Who's fit to govern the garden of the state? Flinchless, the first Elizabeth dead-headed traitors and shut plaguey stages, but she had, I recall, the heart and stomach of a man. She left no issue but art, breastfed on the rich milks of empire her ships plowed the seas to reach. Settlers came here, and native people not yet sick taught them about dyeing cloth blue with false indigo. What hunger for blue, so scarce in nature. Had I myself lived in a warm colony farmed by captive labor circa 1740, I too might have owned a rich crop of color, breeding wealth. Indigo's stench poisoned those who boiled and pounded the leaves, but back then I might have only seen pretty buds. Resilient reminder of forced transplants, false indigo improves poor soil, as if blooming is the best revenge. This sprout I've set will be a triumphant blue shout I'll bow to, salaaming as I weed. Blue tints, so rare they're absent from this antique kellum, scaled now with carp skin. The corners askew, pooch chewed one New Year's Eve in New York's fretwork of fireworks. Good thing the vicar didn't catch me next dawn, old bitch crouched beneath a scything wind off the Gowanus Canal, poking through my mutt scat with a plastic straw picked out of the gutter to make sure the shreds of heirloom vegetable-dyed wool had made a safe backstage exit. I'd not have the vicar's ilk see me bend. No. I kneel only in service to new growth, thickening the history of gardens, tending to those I adore. And I'm going to close actually with a poem, Wishes for 50. So I wanted to close with this poem because I was telling Stephen in the green room, so this is an older poem as well, and I unintentionally plagiarized one of Stephen's poems in an earlier version of this poem. And what happened was, a number of years ago, Stephen came to give a reading from some of his poems that then made it into his wonderful book, Stone Fruit. If you haven't read Stone Fruit, you should. And in Stephen's reading, he read a number of amazing works. There was a poem in which he had a line about, it's a love poem, it's a very sexy love poem, musing on his wife's name, Melissa, and also playing around with the etymology of Melissa from honey, miel, luna di miele, all of these wonderful etymological and playful, but also very, very sensual details. And in that poem, there was a line that went essentially, we'll bruise the sheets and then we'll shoot the breeze. And I thought, oh, that's such a great line. And I came home, I was thinking about it, and wrote it down in a notebook and, mused on it. And it just made its way into my head. And time went by, and I didn't think about its connection to Stephen's poem. Some years passed, and I was working on a poem which was essentially a kind of like, what did I want for 50? I need to write about a wishes for 60 poem, but this is a wishes for 50. I was approaching 50, and I was thinking, okay, I need to how can I cheer myself up? What do I want for this next decade of my life? And it's somehow Stephen's lines from some years earlier were so lodged in my head that they came out in this poem, but I did not recognize them as Stephen's. I thought that I had come up with this brilliant line myself. So in an earlier version of this poem, there's a part about intimacies that you'll hear in here. This poem used to be better because it had Stephen's line in it, and it had this line about bruise the sheets and then shoot the breeze. And then Stephen's book came out in 2016. I read it. I realized what must have happened, that I had just absorbed this poem, and I was terribly embarrassed, and so I did some revising. But this again just shows you how it's like poems are always speaking to other poems, and even when you don't realize it. So it's one of the great pleasures, but also the great dangers of reading great poets, is that they will get into your head. So, wishes for 50. One funny word in here, librocubicularist, is someone who reads in bed. Wishes for 50. Face worn well, though well worn. Not timorous, no shrinking. A pup's nose still for the raw and stinky. Deep pleasure gnawing your bone of work. Neither so sapless you can't weep, nor barked an oak like those can't be wrongs. New songs. Martini glass astringed with a drop of dry skepticism before the gin. Nonetheless, your verre ever half full, and trust enough in the future to plant asparagus. It's obvious you'll never step in that river again. But let your mind spill now and then with sources you'd skinny dip once more if you could. Intimacies? Let there be lascivity with sexy librocubicularists. Loneliness only in tonic doses for its delicious silences. And dusks, when memory's a glass jar dipped from a stream with curls of murk wildly turning, Let them settle until the water clears. So clear it tempts your sip. Salud. Here's water under all the bridges you burned. Thank you.
We were talking in the green room about typos. You always get a typo, a mistake in a book. And she asked me, Penelope asked me if I had found the two in hers. I told her I'd only found one. But I just found the other one.
Yes.
But I didn't think it was a mistake. I thought you had invented the word deluscious.
Oh, that is not it. That is an intentional, that's intentional.
Oh, it was? Oh,
Yes.
okay. And
Oh, no, there's a second typo. You just haven't found it yet.
okay, I will.
Keep looking.
Well, I just saw. Thank you. Okay, and up here, was it delicious up here or delicious?
It should be, it's delicious. It should be delicious.
Then I misread it from
Yeah.
my seat. See, I thought it said delicious. Okay, all right. Well, so let me see. We're going to have a talk with you guys, if you are forthcoming. Hammerheads. Yeah. I got a question or two, but I think it'd be better to hear from the audience. And if you will hold up your hand, then an angelic figure will float out of the sides of the room and come to you with the microphone, so you can enunciate it.
It's so well organized.
It
It's just
is.
like,
If I were doing this, it'd be an utter mess. But if you have yes, here's a question. Is that right, Shannon? Do you have a question? Good.
Sorry to kick things off. I'm thinking a lot about the essay 23rd Century Nature poem when reading your work, and I wonder if, I think that was written in like 2014. I'm wondering if you can talk about the evolution of writing kind of 21st century nature poems over the years. You've said that many of these have come from long ago, and how talking to the nature that we live with now has evolved for you.
yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Well, I mean, I think that one of the things, probably 20 years ago, I wasn't intentionally writing, poems that responded to the environment in any particular way. And, I think it's just become so much more obvious, right? That there's like, this is really, really a problem, and we don't have any answers for it. Or we don't have the will, right? We actually do have some answers. We could solve the problem that we're all facing, but we're just not gonna do it. We're just like lemmings going over the cliff, right? So I think that just started to feel like it was pressing in a way, and also to feel like it's as opposed to being like, oh, I'm going to approach that as a subject, it just feels like it's woven through everything, right? Like it's really hard to take a walk now without thinking about like, what kinds of things that I'm seeing around. I think one of the other things that changed my perception, or probably changed my my way of approaching things, is in 2019, right before the pandemic, I actually had the opportunity to take a training course as a master naturalist in my local forest. And so I am technically a, quote, apprentice master naturalist. I haven't taken Master Naturalist 2 yet, but I'm going to at some point. But it was really an amazing opportunity to take like 4 months and spend basically every weekend out in a local forest, learning about a different part of that ecological system with somebody who's a specialist in that field, right? So it's like we had a geology weekend, and we walked around and we looked at bedrock, and we had a lot of readings, and we would be quizzed on like, what kinds of rock are we walking on? What kind of what's underneath here? Is this bedrock? What is it? What kinds of trees are these? What kind of bird songs are we hearing? So just that kind of stuff that I think many of us notice. Obviously, for me, it was really really useful to take a course that forced me to actually learn something about how all of these systems were connected and to learn how they were operating in my local area. And then also to have a sense from that of what was really threatened, right? And so even though I didn't take that course specifically with the idea that this will inform my poems, it has. I've also been thinking about this in relation to some other projects I'm working on right now. I'm actually involved in a really interesting project I just started with an entomologist, an anthropologist, and a jazz musician. And I'm writing poems that are going to be set to music and performed. And the texts that I'm writing are based on the work of this noted entomologist who studies moths. He's like the world expert on moths. And this anthropologist who works with basically disaster preparedness. And so I'm not quite sure what's going to happen yet, but it's really interesting. I have these piles of readings from both sides of that, the entomologist and the anthropologist. Somehow those will get turned into poems, which will then be put to music and sung. So the opportunity to work with people who are doing this kind of collaborative project, it feels like because there's so much energy around people thinking about the climate and trying to actually come up with solutions to problems, right? What do you do if you're trying to create a disaster preparedness plan for people in a state where there's very little funding for that, or people don't have, resources? It's really interesting to me to hear how people are trying to deal with those issues. And then, of course, that's going to affect my writing because it's in my head and I'm thinking about that. That's kind of a roundabout answer, but does that connect to some of the dots there? Yeah. So. An angel is coming.
I have so many questions, and it was such a beautiful reading, Penelope. I could. Anyway, for one, it's interesting to me, the central elegy in this book, which you didn't read because, of course, it's the longest piece in the book. And I was wondering, having also, spent some time writing elegies for the loss of parents, I'm sort of curious how that went for you and kind of what that experience was like and how you feel. It's interesting to me that Orson Slart starts the book, which is sort of the funniest piece, although I also think in a way it's about legacy and inheritance as well. But if you could talk about that a little bit, I would love to hear.
Thank you. That's a great question too. It's like, God, dead mothers, like, right? It's like you have a mother and then she dies. And it's like, how can you recover from that? You kind of can't, right? Like, I don't know how we get over these things. So that poem nearly killed me. And I actually, so the poem that Patty's addressing, there's a long central poem called A Vinegar of Pearl that I probably tried to write that for like 10 years in different forms. And I started writing it actually while my mother was still alive. And because we had this, close in some ways, but also distant and difficult relationship. And, a lot of what I was trying to do with that poem is just capture this person who was my mother, who did do things like she buried a piano. And like, who does that? Who buries a piano? She wanted to get rid of it, so she buried it.
How did she do that?
She called Bill Trout, the man with the backhoe in her town, and Bill Trout came and he dug it. And my mother, this is when I was at Irvine. I was living in California at this point, and I got this call from my mother one day, and we didn't talk that much on the phone. And she's like, "Oh, I got rid of the piano finally." And I'm like, "Oh, good. Did you donate it to a school, a church? Did some group come in?" She's like, No, I got Bill Trout to come with his backhoe. He dug a hole out near where we buried the horses, and it's out in the field." And you're like, "Oh, okay." So, so I wanted to, I wanted to try to capture some of that, like this person who was so, weird but also brilliant, but also difficult and also like traumatized. I mean, one of the things that came out over the course of my relationship with my mom in her later years, this was like her 80th birthday, when she casually announced at dinner, my husband and I had taken her out for dinner, and she casually announced, she was like, "Oh, I told you about that time that I was in the locked ward and I had electroshock 9 times while I was pregnant with your sister." I was like, no, you didn't tell me that. That's like, I had never heard that story, right? So she had all of these just like amazing life experiences that had happened. She was in the women's Army Corps. She was, she was a veteran. She served in World War II. She'd had all of these amazing experiences, and it just felt like, how do you get that? And then on top of how do you get a portrait of that person, how do you get your feelings about that person who is so complex? And I had such admiration for my mother on so many levels, and yet she was also a mad thing, right? So it felt like that poem took a long time, and one of the ways that made it possible for me to write about that was really to think about it, like to not try to get it in a single poem, right? And that it's a composite poem. It's a poem that takes place in a number of different sections. So it felt like, okay, I can actually approach her from these different angles. I can, these different sort of episodes allow me to think about her from a number of different angles. But one of the things that really helped was there was a point where this goes back to the Hollinshead Chronicles and Shakespeare and King Lear. So one of the things that was happening at around that time is I somehow got connected to the fable, the old story upon which King Lear is based, which is this fable called Love Like Salt. And so just this idea of sort of borrowing that old story, that sort of folk tale, and then also thinking about the way that it had worked its way through King Lear, and using some characters from King Lear, there was a way that allowed me to pull together a lot of different strands from her and figure out, I think, a way to create a composite picture. But I should say, there were a number of pieces in that poem that got thrown away. Like the original title of that poem was The Esker, and there was a lot more geology in the poem. There was a lot about the geological land formation of the Esker, more than anyone wanted to know. And my husband is a great reader, and he's really good at reading things and being like, there's a lot of Esker in this poem. Like, is it about your mother, or is it about an Esker? I think you have to choose. So just being able to sort of pare away and see what wasn't really part of that was necessary to that. But it took so long, and I mean, I've said this elsewhere, but I feel like I wish that I were a really efficient writer and that I wrote a poem that said everything that I wanted to say, and then I was just done with it, as opposed to I have to overwrite everything. Like I have to write hundreds and hundreds of pages and then throw so much of it away and then get to this little thing. So yeah, so it took a really long time for it to figure out what to happen. I don't know if that really answers the question, but so. Are there any other overwriters in the room? I know there's some, right? Yeah, I'm like, what is it? Yeah.
So I have one tiny question and one really big question. The tiny one is, the line echoed with me when you're talking about the snow. The snow everywhere, carefully descending. Is that Frost? Is it Cummings? Does that line ring a bell with you?
Snow everywhere, carefully descending.
No? Okay, never mind. So it's somewhere. It's somewhere. But the snow and
it's gotten into your head.
Yeah, and it was somewhere in there. But, I mean,
could it be Joyce? Is it the ending of The Dead?
Ah, okay.
Is it it's like the snow silently falling on all the churchyard where Michael
something.
Fury was buried, like the snow descending
could
all
be.
over Ireland. I'm not going to be able to quote.
Carefully, that is important.
Yeah, the carefully, yeah.
Descending.
Anyway, so the larger thing is, I mean, your poetry has really been a revelation. I hadn't read your stuff until this week when I knew you were coming, and I love the richness and the play of the words and the way it says things that it doesn't, there's no other way to say them quite directly, which is what I love poetry to do. But I'm wondering about, because there's so much play with words overlapping against each other, so much pleasure in that, and so much wit kind of in laughter, and at the same time these are poems that are very full of mourning and anger and pain. And how do you think about that balancing of the just pleasure of poetic writing with the burden of the things that you're trying to write about?
Yeah, I really like that question too. So one thing I would say is that that playfulness, I mean, this is a really loud book, right? these are not quiet poems. These are poems that they're very performative, right? There's just a lot of performance going on. And I think that one of the things that happens, I mean, that's one way to deal with heavy material, right, is to balance it. And I think I'm very attracted to the way that shifts in register allow us to talk about something that might be really profound or difficult, right? And that there's a way in which, if you can talk about it playfully, it's like, you're laughing while you're weeping, right? And to me, it feels like that's true to the experience of grief, or to some of the more difficult experiences, is that, like, sometimes they're funny, right? Like, there's a way in which, just our human predicament is, like it would kill you, right, if you just were overwhelmed by it. So there's something, it feels like, our brain wants to find the lightness. And I think that in my brain, for me, the way that works is with a kind of wordplay. And that's like, it's a way to work into or towards something that is deeper, that I might not be able to say in a sort of more like plain style way. So I think that that's one way to think about that. But I also think one thing that, I have been asking myself in some ways, like, what these poems really are so performative. They could potentially go over the top. I actually have a friend who's a very dear reader, who has been reading my work for years, and I can tell that he doesn't like this book as much as he liked earlier books, which is, that's okay. The different poems will find different readers. But I know that what he, I think, really responds to is the sort of, the kind of quieter, simpler poems that I've done in earlier work. And I get that. I think that for many readers, that might be what they respond to. And these poems might seem over the top and too performative. And so that's, again, I don't know why they're like that. That's what I was hearing. So that's why they came like this. But I also think that there's this moment that we're in where, I love lyric poems, the sort of the classic lyric poem that is like someone whispering in your ear, this like intimate thing that they're going to speak just to you, right? That's something that is profoundly important to me as a writer. But I also feel like we're in this moment now where like every advertisement is whispering in your ear, right? Like every algorithm is like figured out how to whisper in your ear. It's like you can't do anything without some like computer voice whispering in your ear or trying to be intimate, right? Or sort of overly casual with you. So, sometimes I feel like I read contemporary lyric poems sometimes, and I sometimes feel like this is a poem in which the algorithm has been optimized to serve me what I want. And it does feel like we're sort of in this maybe cultural moment where like that sort of like an affect of plainness or intimacy is, like, to me, it sounds computer generated, because it sounds like that is just one more way that the machine has been trained to talk to us. So in some ways, I think partly maybe what my ear is playing with and enjoying is this idea that like it's all a performance. All poetry is a performance. Even the simplest, most plain style poem is a performance. So let's be honest about that and really play, right? And really have the performance. So I don't know. Maybe that gets at some of that.
Could you say more narrowly what you mean by performative?
Well, just there is so much wordplay, or playing with double meanings, or playing with punning, or playing with rhyme that sort of calls attention to itself. So performative in the sense of like these poems, I think, really want to be spoken aloud, because there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff that I feel like you don't necessarily hear if you're just reading them on the page. Excuse me. So for me, when I say performative, that's sort of what I mean, that they call to that, as opposed to feeling like, I want you to read me quietly to yourself. Also the sense that, obviously, the speaker in many of the poems is akin to a woman of my age who's experiencing things, but some of them are personae, right? So they're not all, so it feels to me like there's like an amplified persona that's like a bigger version of, myself, or a bigger version of a mourning daughter, or a bigger version of something that is more, it feels like is maybe a stagier version of something that is, that is very genuine, but here it's being amplified.
I wonder how many poems I'm going to quit talking, but I wonder how many poems. Microphone. Thank you. Hello, Mike. Thank you, Claudia. I wonder how many poems you've written that speak without performance. Do you not always feel that in writing a poem you have a persona? Is not the poem making a persona as it goes.
Yes, I think that that's the case. But I think that the thing that tends to happen is, again, if with poems that are more a kind of pure lyric, they're hiding that fact, right? Like what they want is to feel unperformed. They want to feel like this really is just somebody whispering to you or, speaking to you. And as I say, I love that, and that's something that I, respond to deeply when it's done well. But I don't know, it feels like something about the subjects of this book. It felt like they wanted to be, my ear was drawn to this louder sort of music. If that makes sense.
No, I got it. There's a hand up.
Hi, thank you for your reading. It was absolutely beautiful. I'm very curious about, you talk about having poems that are in conversation with other works and other writers, and kind of what you were just speaking to about whether it's akin to your own personal voice or personae, but how do you go about that as a poet in the sense of, do you see a work and go, oh, I got to respond to this? Or is it an experience that you have where it reminds you of a work? I mean, I'm sure it's a combination of all of those things, but as a writer, like, what is your approach to being in conversation with other works? Because that's something I'm very interested in as well, and not losing your own voice, but still having a productive, maybe, or not productive, just fun conversation with other works and other writers.
You are clearly a poet. Is that correct? A little bit. Okay, that's good. So I would say like there are different ways maybe that happens. So one thing, an example of really wanting to speak back to something is that poem, A Gaze Hound, right? Where, I'm very clearly speaking back to the Vicar of Wimbish, right? And I had read the Hollinshead Chronicles. I'd read the section about dogs, probably a couple of years before I wrote the poem. Things take a long time with me. That's the other thing, is like they just have to cook for a long time. I often don't know that I'm working on a poem, and then I'll be like, oh my God, it's like this thing has been cooking. And so I had read that, had written it down, had maybe made some notes on it in a notebook, hadn't necessarily known that I wanted to write a poem in response to it, but then started writing something when the pandemic was happening and realized that like the energy and the frustration that I was feeling and trying to articulate there had some connection to this man's pronouncement, right, about what 50-ish women should or shouldn't be doing with their pets. And it was just like this whole sort of like nodule of feeling and frustration that suddenly for me was very clear, like, oh, this is actually in response to that text, and so I'm going to make that overt. Another way that it might happen for me is really less overt, and I might not even realize it until after the fact, like stealing Stephen's line, obviously. But another thing that I can think of might be, so that I think it's the second poem that I read, Cliché, the one about walking along the beach. So it was only after writing that poem that I kind of realized, I was like, oh my God, there are all of these poems in which people walk on the beach and think, right? Like that's kind of a trope in literature. And I'm thinking about things like, or think about like Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach, right? Or think about, one day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. Again, I wrote it with a different hand, and came the waves and made my pains their prey, right? So you're like going back to these Renaissance poems and these, all of these images of walking on the beach. And obviously those are in my head and they're somehow like informing things, but I didn't sit down with that poem and say, I will respond to all of the beach poems, right? I don't know, does that answer that? But I love the idea of, again, like that's a great project for a writer, right? Like take a poem that you love and talk back to it, or take something, take a comment from someone, take a famous quote and write back to it and see what needs to be changed maybe, or what needs to be addressed. So.
I love this conversation, but I'm a little worried about time, and I've left my timer over there someplace. So, Shannon, I'm going to ask you how we're doing.
Maybe one or two more.
Yeah, I was thinking that. Okay. Two more questions, please. Oh, Suddenly we're out of questions. Is that true? Mike, over here. Oh, thank you.
So I'm a gynecologist, and I'm noticing some of the poems about women and their issues, and also the 7-year-old boys. That's just fantastic. But and I saw you flip past. I thought it was elegy to estrogen.
Yes, I didn't
And
read
then
the
also
elegy for
the
estrogen.
abortion. I mean, obviously, I want to read that abortion poem a few more times, and I'm hoping that I'll understand it. But I'm probably going to regret it if I don't ask you to talk more about that poem.
Yeah, sure.
So-
Anything in particular that that would be helpful?
Well, I mean, it's this thing about odors, and you don't realize till the end that she's in the operating room having the procedure, but she's awake and she's smelling things. And I remember that about pregnancy, about how horrible something like a cup of coffee is suddenly the most disgusting thing. And
Yes.
it sticks with you, and then the minute that you're no longer pregnant, all of those things go away. So I assume it has something to do with that, but there were so many layers to what was going on in the background, and anyway, it was just once through. So maybe if I read it 10 more times.
Yeah, no, that's a,
So-
so one of the things, that's a poem in which sense of smell is really important, and it seemed like that, I mean, that was one of the things that I wanted to capture, and it feels like it's a kind of thing I hadn't, I mean, I too knew that, like, oh, pregnant women have a very strong sense of smell. I have a very strong sense of smell anyway. Like, I can sort of walk into a room and, like, smell people, or like I can, not in a bad way, but I have a sense of like really having an olfactory density. So right, just the sense that this sense would be amplified significantly. Like one of the weird things that the body does, right, is that. So I think trying to capture that and trying to I think again, like what is it that one remembers about an experience, or when writing about an experience, and also like what is something that you wouldn't expect to have in a poem, right? Like there are a lot of abortion poems that are maybe they approach different aspects of the subject, but to kind of stay inside this one sense and sort of follow that and use that kind of as the way of those are like the breadcrumbs through the poem, right? Like, how do I write about this difficult thing? I can follow this one sense, and that if I can just follow that one thing, that will give me a way to get through this poem, right? Maybe I'm actually responding a little bit, tying this to the question that the gentleman behind asked too, like writing about sort of more difficult subjects, right? How to do that, and that's not so much a linguistically playful poem, although it does have a lot of rhyme in it, but just this focus on, right, like what would it be to tell the story of this event, but tell it almost entirely through sense of smell. So, does that sort of answer the question? Yeah.
The estrogen?
Yeah. So, like estrogen. Wow, what an amazing thing! Controls so many things in your body, right? And I thought, I'm a woman of a certain age, and I'm sort of like why are people not writing about menopause? Like, it is just this thing that happens to whatever 51% of the population or whatever, if you're lucky enough to live that long. So I thought, well, this is actually this really rich subject, and as a writer, you're like, what hasn't been written about yet, right? So if you find a subject that it feels like there is there's a scarcity of writing about this topic, that makes it interesting. Also, I just think it's it's interesting to think about. I work a lot with figurative language. Figurative language for me is really important. So thinking about what are metaphors for what my body is going through at this point in time. What's a way to articulate what this feels like, or what is a way to articulate what my thinking through this experience is like, that can be accessible to other humans because I can put it into metaphors that make it graspable to them, right? So that's what I was trying to do with that one. So
Thanks a lot.
also we just need more estrogen in the world, right? It's like we should have as much as we have, yeah. Was there one more question? Did I see another?
Back here,
Okay. Aha, hello.
So I heard a sense of very gentle activism in your poems.
Oh, sometimes it's louder.
Yeah, and maybe not so gentle. I'm very interested to see if this is continuation of how you are in life, or is it in reaction to lack of that in life?
So in other words, like if we were to have a conversation, would I be like really out about like people should write about abortions because they're a common reproductive health procedure? I would probably just say that. So I would probably be pretty vocal about that. But you know, I mean, I suppose one thing to think about, or one thing that poems do. So it can be easy, I think, to think of poems as messages, right? Like a poem is a sort of, and I think that this is one of the things that we do badly when we are teaching students, is I think at some point, maybe in high school, a lot of, you know, students are taught to like, a poem is about like, there's a hidden message here. You have to figure out what it is. You're gonna like decode things. And so the first thing I tell all of my students is poems are not messages. It's not about a message. If the poet wanted to send you a message, she would have sent you an email, right? She's not trying to send you a message. If it's an interesting poem to me, right? There may be a message there, absolutely, but I feel like a poem that sets out and like that's what it does is delivers a message is probably not a poem that I'm going to be that interested in. But what I am interested in is the way in which, again, figurative language and some of the musical qualities of language can make very common experiences, again, something that is both familiar and strange, right? You know, nothing could be more common than women having abortions. It happens all the time. You know, it is not a strange thing. But what is it that could make that experience interesting, or a little bit, you know, make us perceive it a little bit differently, make us perceive the experience a little bit differently? And again, for me, that's like thinking through metaphor, thinking through the senses. So yeah, so maybe that like that's. Maybe that's a way to think about it, is that like, you know, a poem that was sort of like upfront, an activist poem telling me how to think about something, I would probably not be that interested in. And that's probably not the kind of poem that I want to write, just because I'm interested not in messages, but in experiences. So I want to create an experience for the reader, and if the reader comes away with a message, then that's great. But the key thing I'm trying to do is to make an experience that maybe wouldn't have been accessible to that person before, maybe they wouldn't have thought about it, maybe they wouldn't have experienced it, to try to make that kind of feeling or thinking through something accessible, again, often by using really tangible language, or like thinking through it in a really sensory way that makes it something that is like granular, right, and really like touchable.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, audience.